It's news review time. Stay tuned to Press TV. Now, according to a new report, Iran is shipping the most amount of crude in almost 5 years, despite U.S. sanctions. Bloomberg cited energy analysts as saying that Iran's oil exports have surged to the highest level since the U.S. unilateral reimposed sanctions on the country in 2018. A large chunk of Iran's crude goes to China as the world's major importer of energy. Several European customers, including Germany, Spain, and Bulgaria, also imported oil from Iran. The crude shipments have doubled since last autumn to reach 1.6 million barrels a day in May. Okay, to discuss this, I'm inviting two guests. Clive Menzies, a political economy analyst and researcher in London. Also with me is Frank Emspak, his radio producer and political commentator in Madison. Good to see you, gentlemen. Now, beginning with Clive, let's look at sanctions. Sanctions, of course, as you know, they do impact people's livelihoods more than maybe the governments that they claim to target. But there are also, this shows that there are ways to go around them and circumvent them, and even to do what is not expected, like what I just told you in the intro, Iran's crude exports that have seen a sharp rise. Let's have your thoughts on this.
Well, we're in the context of considerable changes of seismic proportions. And I think when one talks about sanctions, one cannot ignore what they did last March in terms of imposing sanctions on Russia, which effectively, led by the US and the European Union, was bullied into it to follow suit. Basically, the Western economies have shot themselves in the foot, because in supposedly denying themselves access to Russian oil, then obviously alternatives have to be found, and Iran is an obvious beneficiary of that. But I think more importantly, one needs to understand that there are huge changes afoot, and that oil is very much a principal foundation on which our modern economy is built. I mean, 90% of agricultural inputs in agribusiness are oil-based, as it were. So I think what we're looking at is a considerable change, not just in terms of, if you like, the geopolitical shift from the US-dominated or dollar-dominated hegemony of oil, but you're also juxtaposed by the BRICS. In other words, Russia, China, India, and countries like Iran, Venezuela, finding ways to create alternatives. But one's also looking at seismic changes within the societies themselves, where people are waking up to the fact that their governments are lying to them. And this too is a factor, but perhaps that's a little too complex for this conversation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let me turn to Madison. Frank, let's have your thoughts on this. The West is fueling, especially the U.S., fueling the war in Ukraine. And we have Europe that's energy thirsty. We have people, making demonstrations and protest rallies in Europe. And still, what they do is they keep, imposing sanctions on Iran, especially on the oil sector. And this is what Iran is doing.
Well, I think something is happening here that's pretty on two different levels. First of all, the imposition of sanctions against Russia, and now it's coming out that somebody associated with Ukraine blew up the pipeline, probably the United States with Poland, but nonetheless, or Norway. But what's happened is, of course, that the American gas sales to Russia skyrocketed. So basically, the Europeans are paying for the war by paying the Americans. So this is not sitting well with the rest of the Europeans. The second thing that's happening is a failure of the sanctions. And I think we need to understand that unlike, say, 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, because of the economic strength of China, the sanctions movement is less and less effective. And we see that in two different ways. First of all, as you've pointed out, the Iranian oil exports have increased. But secondly, we see it in the war in Ukraine, when all of a sudden the Russians are getting apparently getting thousands of drones from from Iran, and the drones are making a big difference on the battlefield. Well, how is that happening? You're talking about obviously something in Iran of a ability to manufacture these things, get the parts needed, have the skills, have the industry, and that's a game changer. And finally, what you saw here in the United States was suddenly a realization that, wait a minute, the Chinese made this deal between the Iranians and the Saudis. They didn't ask us.
Right.
And that's the first time any significant deal has been made in the Middle East, probably in 50 years, without the United States being the broker. So all of that undermines sanctions.
Interesting. Now, Clive, speaking of what China did, the brokering this rapprochement between Tehran and Riyadh. So we have Iran and Saudi Arabia, both members of OPEC. So how do you look at this prospect of OPEC pricing and quota and all that? We have Iran, Saudis, and Iran and other countries in the Persian Gulf region getting together and forming alliances.
Well, I think this is indicative of the seismic changes that I think Frank has alluded to, as I did earlier. And in 1971, when under Richard Nixon, the US dollar was taken off the gold standard, basically it was US military might that enforced the price of oil globally, and everything was dealt in dollars. Clearly, we're in a very different position now, where the US is no longer a pivotal player. The US empire is declining, albeit slowly. It may well accelerate, and I think to some extent they're helping their own demise. I mean, the sanctions on Russia were just one instance, but the war in Ukraine is increasingly apparently a NATO war to effectively try and weaken Russia. But Russia is not only getting weapons from Iran, but it's developed highly sophisticated weaponry, which outclasses most of what NATO has got. So clearly, we've lived in a world in my generation of US hegemony, where basically the US and the dollar dominated the world. That is rapidly evaporating. And yes, we're going into a multipolar world, but I think we're going beyond that into a more distributed or decentralized world.
Right. And Frank, we have a couple of minutes left. So given this de-dollarization process that's happening, and that's mostly thanks to the sanctions that the U.S. has imposed on countries like Iran, Russia, and others, and apart from alliances they're forming, like one of them also, the role that they can play in organizations like OPEC, that could also affect the oil prices. So what's the prospect like? What's the future like?
What's the future like? I think future is with us. Yesterday or today, a major American chip maker announced a factory in China. In spite of all of the stuff, they announced a $2 billion investment. So I think what's happening is that politically, the Biden administration can say what it wants in certain ways, but economically speaking, the American economy cannot cut itself off from the world, particularly the advanced part of the economy. And so that group of people is undermining the politics of the administration. At the same time, the United States understands, politically understands that something has to change. And there have been initiatives, I understand, at least from the New York Times, between the Biden administration and Iran. It's to begin to talk about what to do. And at the same time, you have a group of Republicans who've attacked the administration this morning, saying that if they do anything at all, they're going to go after the administration. So I think it's quite contradictory. I don't think we know what's going to happen exactly, or the balance of forces, what's going to be like. We have an election coming up where Biden is going to be pushed from the right not to do anything about Iran. On the other hand, I think that the foreign policy establishment recognizes that pulling out of all these different treaties was a mistake. And they got to do something about it because the club, sanctions, is not working with the way it did anymore.
Okay, thank you so much for the insight. Clive Menzies in London, Frank Emspeck in Madison. And that's the end of this edition of the News Review on Press TV.